Good evening, all. I'm John Boyle, Director of the Graduate Program in Catholic Studies here at the University of St. Thomas. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th Annual Thought and Culture Lecture. The Thought and Culture Lecture series seeks to bring to a public forum the reflections of the Catholic Studies faculty on the truth and vitality of Catholicism and its impact on human thought and culture. Dr. David Foote originally came to St. Thomas as a member of the history department, and I was at the time delighted to hear that he was a medievalist. I think it was Dr. Kennedy who arranged for Dr. Foote and me to meet over lunch. Dr. Foote clearly had the full toolkit of the medieval historian, working on important issues in the relation of church and culture in 12th and 13th century Italy. One need only consider the title of his book, published by the University of Notre Dame Press, Lordship, Reform, and the Development of Civil Society in Medieval Italy, the Bishopric of Orvieto, 1100 to 1250. But what was immediately evident in that first of what was to be many lunches was simply the breadth of his study and interests. We ended up, as I recall, talking about late medieval philosophy, or maybe it was Plato. Of course, those of you fortunate enough to have studied with Dr. Foote need no introduction to the substance and breadth of his mind. One need only consider the courses he teaches in the CSMA program. Catholic Thought and Culture 1, Catholic Thought and Culture 2, St. Francis and His World, and of course, very important for our program, Secularization. And this is just on the graduate level. Dr. Foote and I share an interest in the thought of Romano Guardini. Here, too, I have benefited from having Dr. Foote as a colleague and as a friend. He has helped me understand Guardini in any number of ways, and I look forward to learning yet more this evening. It is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. David Foote.
Well, thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? I think this mic works fairly well. Well, just to begin with a caveat, for those of you who may have had a course with me, you know that I'm tied to PowerPoint. And for those who haven't had a course from me, I'm tied to PowerPoint. And I've been doing it for a long time. And so I've invented every possible way you could possibly abuse PowerPoint. So again, I just put that forward as a caveat. So today we're going to talk about Romano Guardini and why he matters. But before we talk about Romano Guardini, I want to tell you a little bit about my love life. We were spring cleaning the other day while it was snowing, and I was working through my, just kind of cleaning out the drawers, and I ran across a picture of my first love. Her name was Ambeline. Can everybody see okay? I was taken with her. I met her when I was a freshman in college, and she had the cutest little button nose. Well, actually, is that her nose or is that her nose? Well, anyway, she had just these wonderful eyes. I mean, just look at them. Is that her eye or is that her ear? Well, I guess the problem with Ambeline, I could never make heads or tails of her. But anyway, so as you well know, this was not my first girlfriend. The reason why I'm showing, these are these famous Gestalt pictures, right? And the whole point of the Gestalt picture is to point out that just in the very way we perceive things and the very way we know things, there's what some philosophers call a hermeneutical circle working. And so in order to know a particular part, we have to contextualize it and understand the whole to which it belongs. And so I can take this as an ear or an eye, but it all depends on how I contextualize that one particular part before that shows up for me as either an eye or an ear, and so on. So the first thing that I want to put forward, just kind of put in the back of your mind as we begin to talk about Romano Guardini, is this relationship between whole and part. Because I think one of the reasons why Romano Guardini matters is he thought very, very seriously about the relationship of whole and part. So now, just before we dive into Romano Guardini, it might be worth just kind of talking about a few of the highlights of his life, just to give you a sense of who he was. So we'll just run through this very quickly, and I think I'm going to need my glasses to see this. So Romano Guardini was born in 1885 in Verona, Italy. But when he was 1 year old, his family moved to Germany, to Mainz, and his father worked in the import-export business in Mainz. So despite his Italian name, he grew up in Germany. He spoke German. He was a German. In 1903 to 1908, he got his degree. He actually sort of bounced around a bit for a while at University of Freiburg, for a while at Tübingen, and then also for a while at Munich. He decided to go to the priesthood. He studied at seminary from 1908 to 1910 at Mainz. He was ordained a priest in 1910, and then he decided that he wanted to teach in the universities. So he went and worked on his doctorate at Freiburg from 1910 to 1915. He wrote his dissertation on St. Bonaventure's doctrine of salvation. And then he decided, in order to teach in the German universities, in order to obtain a position as professor, you have to write a second thesis called a Habilitationsschrift. So he wrote his Habilitationsschrift again on St. Bonaventure, on his text, Journey of the Mind to God. Now, in 1923, he obtained his first academic position, and we'll talk a little bit about this toward the end of the lecture. I'm hoping we get there, because we have a lot to do. But just in case we don't, he obtained this strange position at the University of Berlin, and it was a chair in the philosophy of religion and Catholic Weltanschauung, or Catholic worldview. And we'll have more to say about that after a while. He taught at Berlin until 1939. Then he was visited by a Nazi official who said, "We're going to force you into retirement for a while." So during the war years, he was forced into retirement. After World War II, he came out, and he was offered the same type of position at Tübingen from 1945 until 1948. 3 years later, he was offered the same position at the University of Munich, where he finished out his career and retired in 1963, passed away in 1968. So there's just sort of a very kind of bird's eye view of at least his academic biography. Now, the theme that I want to kind of that I've chosen as the kind of the structural theme for our talk is actually a short little pithy saying or passage from an essay he wrote in the 1920s called "Reflections on the Relationship Between Christianity and Culture." And I think this little pithy saying goes right to the very heart of his lifelong project. So, the task of Christian culture is twofold. On the one hand, to penetrate and transfigure nature by grace, and on the other, to unlock revelation and take possession of it by means of nature. Now we're going to kind of reflect upon this throughout much of the evening, but once again, I want to notice there's this, at least a version of the hermeneutical circle going on. And this is going to be a fundamental theme really throughout our discussion tonight. And the hermeneutical circle here is the revelation of the Logos on the one hand, and then nature on the other hand. And as we'll see, essentially for Guardini, it's both the Logos. There are two different manifestations of the Logos. So, in thinking about our game plan tonight and thinking about how I want to attack this, our question is, well, what does this pithy little saying actually mean? And if we understand what this pithy little saying means, we can understand why Guardini matters. Now, the key to understanding the meaning of this little slogan is that it's actually an attempt by Guardini to resolve a problem. So actually, in order to understand or find the key to understanding this little slogan is to understand the problem that he's trying to solve. And so actually, as it turns out, most of our time tonight is going to be about understanding the problem he was attempting to resolve. And I actually hope we get to Guardini at the end of the lecture. But even if we don't, we will actually understand why Guardini matters, because we will understand how important he saw the problem to which he devoted his life. So the game plan, this problem actually has two faces, and we're going to look at the surface manifestation of the problem to begin with. And the surface manifestation is really the way in which the universities were developing institutionally and structurally from the early 19th century or early 20th century, really up through the present. And then after we take a quick look at the institutional structures and their development, we're going to look beneath the surface and ask, what is the theoretical soil from which these structures and practices develop? And then if we've made it that far, then we will be able to turn our attention quickly and get a sense of how Guardini went about trying to address these problems and challenges. So there's our agenda for tonight. So let's see if we can make a little headway. So here, problem number one with using PowerPoints is you don't crowd it up with a lot of information, because you immediately lose people. And in order to show you how what a horrible effect this has, I've actually done it. So you can experience it and not make PowerPoints like this. So point number one, as we're thinking about the development of institutions, particularly academic institutions in the early 20th century, I want to call upon a concept that I'm referring to as an academic imaginary. And you are the first people on this planet who have actually ever heard that term. I'm using it for the first time tonight. The term actually comes, I'm borrowing it from a philosopher named Charles Taylor. And in his book, A Secular Age, he uses this concept that he calls a social imaginary. And I think it's actually a very useful concept to get our arms around. And my concept of an academic imaginary is really just borrowed from Charles Taylor's concept. So let's stop and think for a second, what is a social imaginary? Well, bottom line for Taylor, a social imaginary is essentially a worldview. So a worldview, according to Taylor, this is sort of Taylor's definition of the concept. It's the way ordinary people imagine the world and expect it to behave. So every day I wake up and I assume that the world is going to operate a certain way. I expect you're going to act a certain way. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. I just go out and act, go out into the world, and I know the world's going to be the way it's going to be. And that is my worldview in many ways, my social imaginary. So it's our understanding of the whole situation within which particular features of our world show up. Now again, I'm hoping you're hearing this hermeneutical circle, whole and part. My expectations about the whole are going to shape the way I expect individual aspects of my day to show up. So there's, to begin with, a very, very general description of what Taylor calls the social imaginary. Now, why is it social? Well, for two reasons. It's social because it is that common understanding that you and I share. And it makes possible us to act together as a society. It makes it possible for us to coordinate our activities without spending a whole lot of time thinking about it. So there's the first sense in which it is a social imaginary. The second sense in which it's a social imaginary is that it is largely structured by social institutions, political institutions, economic institutions like the market, cultural institutions like the media. Again, I get up every day and I participate in the structures and practices of 21st century United States. And in participating in those structures and practices, I develop a certain set of expectations on how the world is going to behave. And so again, there's a second sense why this imagination or this imaginary is a social imaginary. Now, the third important aspect to keep in mind about a social imaginary is the relationship between theory and practice in these social imaginaries. Now, for Taylor, these social imaginaries often begin as a theory held by a relatively small group of people. But every now and then, a theory catches on, and people begin to be impressed with the theory, and they begin to work it into the practices and structures of everyday life. So, for example, think about someone like Adam Smith, who begins to theorize the nature of market interactions. His ideas catch on. They begin to become structured in the market activities and institutions of everyday life. And as it turns out, there's a very real sense in which everybody here has read The Wealth of Nations, despite the fact that there's probably not a single person here who has ever cracked The Wealth of Nations. Well, how did we come to learn The Wealth of Nations? Well, we get up every day and we participate in the market. And so there is a sense in which the ideas of The Wealth of Nations are written into our everyday habits, despite the fact that we've never cracked the book. So there is this sense in which theory gradually filters into the everyday practices of people in a culture or in a society, and therefore theory becomes part of everyday practice without us ever really thinking about it. So we apply this to the concept of an academic imaginary, and the idea that I want to propose to you now is that, well, we all participate in academic life. And academic life consists of particular structures. It consists of particular practices. And just the very fact that we engage in these structures and practices means that we are assimilating certain expectations about the way the world operates. So there's sort of the basic idea I have in mind with this concept of an academic imaginary. So with that, now let's step into Guardini's world in the early 20th century and begin to think about how this plays out. So Guardini begins his academic career in the 1920s, early 1920s. So we're in the interwar period. Europe and Germany are in crisis. They've just emerged out of one orgy of violence, and they're getting ready to enter into another. And in many ways, Germany is ground zero of this crisis. So there was a great deal of pessimism in the air hovering over Europe in the 1920s. But if we enter into the universities, the university is actually a place that's really very vibrant in the early 20s. And there's also a lot of room for optimism This is the period really in the history of the universities where we see the formation and crystallization of the structures of the university that we now know. This is the period when we're seeing the academic disciplines emerge in the form that we know them, in their differentiation, in their formation, and so on. So with the crystallization of these structures of the academy, this really is a period of tremendous intellectual ferment across the disciplines. Now, one of the unintended consequences of this institutional development of the universities is it tended to convey a sense that knowledge was fragmented. Because as we see the emergence of this institutional structure in the 1920s, we begin to see a horizontal segmentation of the disciplines. So you go here and you study economics, you go here and study political thought, you go here and study ethics. And so the structure of the academic disciplines now begins to appear like a series of essentially discontinuous realities. So this new structure tended to fragment knowledge horizontally, and it also tended to fragment knowledge vertically, because one of the essential features of this new emerging academic worldview was that there was a really pretty aggressive claim to autonomy from any input from any religious ideas, and certainly from the input of Christian revelation. So we find this fragmentation both horizontally and vertically settling into the academic expectation. Now, the caveat here, of course, is the universities didn't invent this segmentation or differentiation. This is happening in all sectors of political and social life in Europe. So, the pros and cons of this process of differentiation and specialization. Well, first of all, it was a sort of a methodological decision that actually bore a lot of fruit. And one of the ways, or one of the analogies we can use to begin to think about the significance of this process is to think of the analogy of a laboratory. You know, a scientist goes into a laboratory, and a laboratory is a controlled environment where a scientist wants to test the way in which a particular number of variables interact with each other. And so in order to focus on these variables, they create a controlled environment which isolates all other aspects of reality. And in many ways, the segmentation of the academic disciplines is designed for this very reason. We're going to come in here and we're going to look at the variables that shape economic behavior, and we're only going to look at these variables so that we can understand the proper or the nature of the interaction of economic facts. We're not going to take into account ethics, political science, philosophy, or anything like that. But what this does is it allows us to produce genuine knowledge about the nature of economic activity. So it is a very, very fruitful and a fruitful methodological decision, and it produces real knowledge and understanding about the world. But the cons of drawing an economic or an academic map of segmented realities is that after years of participation and practice in these structures, this method comes to be mistaken for truth. So we come here and practice reality segmented in various autonomous sectors, and we go out into the world and we begin to expect that the world is indeed isolated or composed of isolated, autonomous, discontinuous sectors of reality. One of the terms that philosophers of science sometimes use for this subtle transformation is they say that a methodological reduction becomes an ontological reduction. And so there are the fundamental pros and cons of this formation of academic structures and practices as they form in the early 20th century and are still with us today. And so here we come to really the essential point that I want to put on the table regarding academic imaginaries. So there are a number of, we can think of a number of unfortunate results that emerge out of this academic imaginary. But what Guardini realized is this creates very difficult conditions for Christian belief. Because I come in and I practice this for a number of years. I buy into the methodological map, and I think that this is the map of reality itself. And so I go out into the world and I say, well, there's economic activity over there, has nothing to do with ethical thought over there, has nothing to do with politics over there. And as a believer, I ask myself, well, where is Christ the Logos to be found? I mean, isn't Christ the Logos the pattern of all of creation? But then I walk out into the world, and the world is this incredibly fragmented thing, and I can't make heads or tails of connecting Christ the Logos, after whom all of reality is patterned, and this very fragmented, fractured world that I have learned to imagine from participating in the academic life. So Guardini was very much aware of this disconnect that tended to emerge from the situation. And he describes really two common strategies that he noticed among his contemporaries in early 20th century Germany. One strategy, he says, he finds believers who are no longer able to really make sense of the connection between their faith and the world. And so in response, they retreat into their faith, and they retreat into essentially an otherworldly faith that has a very difficult time touching down in the real world. Guardini has a very interesting way of describing this strategy. He says, to save redemption by the Son, this strategy has been forced to abandon creation by the Father. Now, a second strategy he describes and says is every bit as prevalent is we can go the other direction or steer into the opposite ditch. And here we can seek refuge in the terra firma of the academic disciplines. But this strategy tends to end up essentially pitching its tent down in the plain, so to speak, and it loses touch with transcendence. And what we typically find the outcome of this particular strategy is we tend to see this development of a civic religion that is very much rooted in the world of secular affairs, and has largely lost touch with revelation and transcendence. So here we begin to get a sense of the fundamental problem which Guardini was trying to address. So Guardini describes his project, his academic and spiritual project, is trying to recover a sense of the overall unity of Christian existence. So on the one hand, he accepts the full validity of academic methodology, recognizing that it is absolutely important in the pursuit of knowledge. But he is very careful that while accepting this academic methodology, he's not going to mistake it for a map of the world itself. So in the early chapters of one of his books called Freedom, Grace, and Destiny, he sort of spells out the nature of his academic work. He says, the time has come for us to take our stand again, to think and live in Christian existence as a whole, in the sense of the Pauline words, all is yours, but you are Christ's. It is time to realize that all divisions have only a methodological value. So here's the big point. and that what really exists is the world and man in the world. It is time to consider the world as a whole. So again, here we come back to the silly picture of Anne Boleyn again. So this has been the basic directive for all my work, namely the attempt to view the pattern of Christian existence as a whole. So the question is, well, where is the whole to be found? And for Guardini, the whole is to be found in the hermeneutical circle, but the hermeneutical circle between revelation and the world. So again, we come back to our our slogan, or Guardini's slogan. The task of Christian culture is twofold. On the one hand, to penetrate and transfigure nature by grace. On the other, to unlock revelation and take possession of it by nature. So there's the surface of the problem. So now let's go beneath the surface, because remember, thinking of the way Taylor describes social imaginaries, he says social imaginaries often begin as theories, and then they seep into common everyday practices. So what I want to do in this next part is to leave the problem of structures and institutions and academic imaginaries and begin to think about the theory out of which these structures and practices emerged. And in order to do this, what I want to do is to bring Guardini into dialogue with Max Weber. In 1917, toward the end of his life, Max Weber delivered a famous lecture. The title of it was Science as a Vocation. And I don't think we'll find any particular article that does a better job of spelling out the underlying theory from which these practices that I've just described have emerged. So in order to get a sense of the real theoretical challenge that really defines Guardini's life work, I think if we walk through, just to kind of take a quick walk through this article, A Science as a Vocation, we can begin to get a sense of where the real challenge lies, or where the real theoretical challenge lies. So let's take a look at Science as a Vocation. The lecture that Guardini delivers, that Weber delivers in 1917 is directed to an audience of students, and essentially the question that Weber is trying to address is, well, here's a bunch of students here. Many of them are trying to ask themselves, do I want to pursue an academic career? And so what Weber tries to do is to lay out what he describes as the internal conditions of the academic vocation. And he's going to spell out these conditions and say, well, if this sounds like what you want to do, then this is the job for you. But before you dive into the game, I want you to be very, very clear just exactly what it is you're buying into. So as he describes the internal conditions of the academic vocation, he essentially describes three fundamental conditions that one needs to understand before one takes the plunge. These three conditions are specialization, the way in which the academic disciplines progress, and then finally this process which he terms intellectualization, which really gets us to the heart of the matter. So let's begin to look at these three internal conditions that Weber lays out as the keys to understanding the nature of the academic vocation. So specialization, he sums it up in a very short passage. In our time, the internal situation of the sciences is, first of all, conditioned by the fact that science has entered a phase of specialization previously unknown, and that this will forever remain the case. This is something we all know well. I don't know if you ever heard the joke. As you go through and get your master's and your PhD, the more with each degree you learn, you know more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. There's the joke about specialization. So the second internal condition is progress. Scientific work is chained to the course of progress. In science, each of us knows that what he has accomplished will be antiquated in 10, 20, 50 years. Whoever wishes to serve science has to resign himself to this fact. We cannot work without hoping that others will advance further than we have. In principle, this progress goes on ad infinitum. And let me call your attention to ad infinitum because for Weber, that is absolutely key and has some very, very interesting consequences, which we'll see in just a second. So let's put these first two internal conditions together. Specialization plus progress ad infinitum equals meaninglessness. So Weber says, if you feel called to an academic vocation, the next thing you need to understand is that the academic vocation is ultimately meaningless. Okay, interesting. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, first of all, the progress of specialization. It runs into ever increasingly narrow fields of research. But how is it that we understand the meaning of anything? We have to put it into the big picture. Here's our hermeneutical circle. And given that the progress of academic research is toward ever increasingly narrow degrees of specialization, you're moving in the opposite direction that one needs to move in order to understand the ultimate meaning of something. So there's point number one for Weber. Second, progress ad infinitum is really the big point to understand, which leads us to the conclusion that what we do is ultimately meaningless. Because if any given academic discipline is moving ad infinitum, then there is no endpoint from which we can measure the meaning of what we're doing. So again, we might think of if I'm traveling to Chicago, everything I do between here and Chicago has a meaning, and that is to get to Chicago. But what if I hop in my car and I travel on for eternity? I have no destination, therefore my journey has no endpoint by which I can measure the ultimate meaning of what I'm doing. And really that's the simple point that Weber wants to make. But this has a lot of very, very interesting implications. Let's think back to what we were thinking about, our earlier discussion about academic method, for example, and how truth becomes method. For Weber, here are sort of the underlying theoretical underpinnings for this point. So the destination gives meaning to my journey. If I am on a journey that has no measurable ending point, then I have nothing by which to measure the meaning of my journey. So again, if I'm in the car and I'm heading for eternity, there's only me and my car and nothing else. Well, if I'm on the academic journey and there's no ultimate ending point by which I can measure the meaning of what I'm doing, there's only me and my method, right? And this kind of dawned on me, because I remember when I was an undergrad, and I found this really puzzling. But I was going through my general education requirements, and I went to sociology class, and the assignment was observe something and use this method, and interpret it using this method. I went to my English class, read this poem and choose one method. I went to political science class, analyze this event and use one of these methods. And then when I read this article, it dawned on me. None of us knew why we were using this method other than, well, this is what political scientists do. This is what people reading literature do. And as it turns out, it kind of makes sense. I was learning a method. None of us knew the meaning of it, but that's the whole point. There is no meaning to it. There's just me and my method. So now we begin to get a very, very kind of interesting sense of the underlying theoretical developments that are taking place that begin to describe and help us understand the formation of this thing that I called an academic imaginary. Well, then the obvious question that comes up for Weber then, as he's trying to make his argument, is, well, what's the point then? Why become an academic if what I'm doing is meaningless? And he says, well, really the key to understanding the vocation of an academic is to realize that an academic is a participant in a long historical process that has been going on for thousands of years, and this process is called intellectualization. Now, what is the process of intellectualization? Scientific progress is a fraction, the most important fraction of the process of intellectualization which we have been undergoing for thousands of years, and which nowadays is usually judged in such an extremely negative way. We'll understand in just a second why it's judged in an extremely negative way. So what is intellectualization? Intellectualization means that principally there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. And here we come across that famous Weberian phrase that's often used to describe the fundamental or defining characteristic of secularization. To live in a secularized world is to live in a disenchanted world. Well, let's continue to explore this concept of intellectualization, because it is really an idea that goes to the very, very core of what it means to live in a secular age. So, for Weber, intellectualization is a historical process that's been going on for about 3,000 years, and we can lay out the phases, the historical phases of this process as follows. We begin in the age of ancient polytheisms, back in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. But then, during the 1st millennium BC, there's an interesting transformation taking place, and we can refer to this as the Age of Meaning. Sometimes various historians and philosophers refer to this as the Axial Age. But what we find in the Age of Meaning is an attempt to couple or connect science and ethics. And we'll see how this works in just a second. Now, we can identify two stages in this Age of Meaning, in this second phase. One phase is the rise of philosophical religions and philosophical and moral cosmologies during the 1st millennium BC. So here we have the rise of things like Platonism, Hinduism, Confucianism are all developments that belong to this particular phase. Then we come along with the birth of Christianity, and this gives a new character to this Age of Meaning. But then finally, we come all the way up to the modern period, and according to Weber, once we hit roughly the 18th, 19th century, we have actually gone back to the world of ancient polytheisms. Only we now live in a disenchanted polytheistic age, but we are, for all intents and purposes, living back in an age of polytheism. So what does he mean by this? Let's begin to kind of unpack this idea. In order to give a sense of what the fundamental characteristic of this second Age of Meaning was, Weber directs our attention to Plato and Plato's project, and he tries to give us kind of a fundamental definition of what's going on here by describing what's going on with Plato. And so, after describing the way Plato sought in his dialogues to arrive at logically consistent ideas of, for example, what justice is, or what love is, or so on, Weber makes this comment. And from this, it seemed to follow that if one only found the right concept of the beautiful, the good, or, for instance, of bravery, of the soul, or whatever, that then one could grasp its true being. And this, in turn, seemed to open the way for knowing and for teaching how to act rightly in life. And for these reasons, one engaged in science. So in other words, he's saying, why did people investigate the world during this age of meaning? Well, they thought that if they investigated the world, they could uncover or discover the meaning of the world. And if I understand the meaning and purpose of the world, then I can organize my life in accordance with that meaning and purpose, and therefore I can be a happy, well-developed human being. Weber says this idea, this linking of science and ethics, continued on into early modern science, where we find scientists trying to understand the book of nature in order to understand God's providential designs so that we could live in accordance with the book of nature. So again, Weber writes, if you recall Swammerdam's statement, here I bring you the proof of God's providence in the anatomy of a louse. You will see what the scientific worker, influenced indirectly by Protestantism and Puritanism, conceived to be his task, to show the path of God. So the underlying point here is science. And here, when Weber uses the term science, he's talking about all forms of knowledge, not just natural science. But we investigate the world in order that we might learn how we ought to live. But we came to the end of the illusion during the modern period for a large number of reasons, but in many ways, through the discovery of infinity, we have finally been disabused of the illusion that we can actually study the world and understand its meaning or purpose. So Weber writes, who aside from certain big children still believes that the findings of astronomy, biology, physics, or chemistry could teach us anything about the meaning of the world? If there is any such meaning, along what road could one come upon its tracks? If these natural sciences lead to anything in this way, they are apt to make the belief that there is such a thing as meaning of the universe die out at its very roots. Now that's a really sobering statement if you allow it to sink in, right? If you're a student at the university and you're paying the least bit of attention, you're going to understand that there is no intrinsic meaning to the world. There is the academic imaginary. Now, I was reminded a couple months ago just how deeply this theory has seeped into the popular imagination. When I went to a coffee shop and I got a coffee, and you know how these coffee cups often have little slogans, you know, to kind of brighten up your day. And the slogan on the coffee cup, I don't know if you can see it, life is a blank canvas. And what is the meaning of that? There is no intrinsic meaning to the world. The world lies in front of us inert. And any meaning that the world has is going to be the meaning that I impose upon it. It's what I paint upon the world. And so here's a very, very kind of interesting idea that we see starting as theory and beginning to seep its way into the popular imagination. It's essentially a Nietzschean idea. Interestingly enough, Weber was both a neo-Kantian and he was deeply read in Nietzsche. And so in a strange sort of way, you get this coffee cup, and it's like writing a book, Nietzsche and chicken soup for the soul. And it doesn't seem to fit, but now it has been so domesticated that it is chicken soup for the soul, right? So this is one of these it's a wonderful description of how theory becomes a social imaginary. So where does this leave us? Where do we belong now, living in the world in which we live? Weber says, now after all these former illusions, the way to true being, the way to true nature, the way to true God, the way to true happiness have all been dispelled. What are the new conditions of belief in this world? Well, he writes, the various value spheres of the world stand in irreconcilable conflict with each other. The elder Mill, whose philosophy I will not praise otherwise, was on this point right when he said, if one proceeds from pure experience, one arrives at polytheism. We live as did the ancients, when their world was not yet disenchanted of its gods and demons, only we live in a different sense. As Hellenic man at times sacrificed to Aphrodite, and at other times to Apollo, and above all, as everybody sacrificed to the gods of his city, so do we still nowadays. Only the bearing of man has been disenchanted. So this is what Weber means, that we have returned to the age of polytheism. Not that we worship the polytheistic gods, obviously, but that we now live in a world of irreducible value pluralism, which is essentially the world of polytheism. So we have two visions of the world, two visions of the human person rising up, and we can think of Plato, whom Weber chooses as sort of the example of a classical vision of the world and a classical vision of the human person. And we have Weber's articulation of what it means to live in the modern period. So what I want to do now, very quickly, is articulate some of the basic values that spell out or define these two views of the world and two views of the human person. And in case you've forgotten about what you shouldn't do on a PowerPoint, I'm going to remind you again. So the classical world and the kind of fundamental idea of the classical world and the classical view of the human person. First, the world. The world is saturated or imbued with what we call the transcendental values, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Classical philosophers saw the true, the good, and the beautiful as values that are inherent in everything that exists. If something has being, it has truth. If something has being, it is good because it has a purpose. And if something has being, it is beautiful. So, as a person, I can look at the world, and through the use of my intellect, I can understand the truth about the world. Because the world is good, I can understand the world's meaning and purpose. I can uncover it through intellectual or rational investigation. And I can understand the fundamental beauty that is inherent in everything that exists. So my intellect can perceive meaning in the classical view of the world. Now my will, in the classical view of the person, the human will was an appetite for the good. But in this view, in this classical view of the person, the will as an appetite is blind, and it needs to be guided to its proper object. It needs to be guided to the real good that it hungers for. And that is precisely the role of the intellect. So if we think about the relationship between the will and the intellect in the classical view of the human person, the intellect has two functions to serve. First, there's an identifying function. The intellect tells the will, yes, that's the good you're looking for, choose it. But then after the intellect has identified the true good, then the intellect tells the will how you go about achieving the good that has been identified. And so this second function is what we might call an instrumental function, what we typically refer to as instrumental rationality. So, what is a happy person? A happy person is a person who is, we might say, in true with themselves. So all of the working parts of a human person are brought into a working harmony. The intellect has identified the good, so now that I am in harmony with myself, my intellect, will, passions, my body, soul, then I can be in harmony with you. And I cannot be in harmony with you if I am not in harmony with myself. And then I can also be in harmony with the universe, with the world. I can understand the purpose of the world. I can organize my activities in relation to the world. And then ultimately I can be in harmony with God. And all of this is made possible by my intellect investigating the world, understanding its meaning, and I can then become in true or at peace with myself, with you, the world, and with God. That is a happy person. In the classical view of the person and the world. Now, what does this look like in Weber's new concept or the discovery of the nature of the world and the person in the modern period? The will is still an appetite. It is still blind. It still longs for the good. But now the intellect has no identifying function to play. The will is blind, and the will chooses a good, and it chooses that good blindly. Now, what the intellect can still do, though, is the intellect still can and does instruct the will on how to go about achieving the value it has otherwise arbitrarily chosen. So what we see is a shrinking or a reduction of an understanding of the relationship between the intellect and the will. Now the intellect only has an identifying or an instrumental function to play. So that is why the world is a blank canvas. My intellect has no capacity to understand any meaning in the world. So when I choose something, I just leap for it and go. But I don't really know if there is any intrinsic value in what I choose, because actually, as it turns out, there is no intrinsic value in what I choose. The will is a blind appetite, and so I choose this, you choose that, I choose Apollo, you choose Aphrodite, on and on and on. We are in the world of an irreducible multiplicity of value spheres. So here are the two fundamental fundamental visions of the world that Weber's spelling out. So then, what is an academic for? Well, if you're an academic and have an academic vocation, your job is to participate in this ongoing historical, cultural process of intellectualization. So among the things that an academic does, we disabuse students of the idea that there is intrinsic meaning to the world. That there is any such thing as values that are intrinsically right or valid. But what we can do is, okay, you have chosen this particular value. I can teach you how to rationally implement the values that you have blindly or arbitrarily chosen. And this is what it means to master the world through calculation. So suppose you value sustaining life. I can't tell you whether there is any real value in that or not, but what I can tell you, suppose you decide you want to be a doctor because you like sustaining life, I can tell you based on my knowledge of how the world works, this is how you sustain life. You may just as well want to not sustain life. And I can't tell you if there's any intrinsic value in doing that, but I can tell you how you go about not sustaining life. You may decide to save the environment. I can tell you how to do that, but I can't tell you if there's any real intrinsic value in doing so, and so on. So here we have an underlying or a theoretical underpinning for the horizontal differentiation of discipline into discontinuous sectors. They're all autonomous value spheres. You want to study economics? Well, good. Here's how you go about studying economics. Can't tell you there's any real value in it. You want to study history? Well, here's how you go about studying history, and on and on. So this is the very interesting and kind of strange view of the academic vocation that Weber spells out. One last point that Weber makes then. Where does theology belong in this? Is theology a science? In other words, do the claims of revelation have any place whatsoever in the academy? And here again, we're talking about now the theoretical underpinnings for the vertical segmentation of the disciplines and the cordoning off of academic life from any claims of revelation whatsoever. So, first of all, Weber says, well, the tension between the value spheres of science and the sphere of the holy is unbridgeable. So he's going to say, well, they have nothing at all to do with each other. Well, why is that so? Well, according to Weber, he says that classical Christian theology is guilty of two fundamental transgressions. First of all, it actually claims validity for a particular value sphere. And according to Weber, the intellect just simply doesn't have that capacity. So this violates the silence of reason by unjustifiably reinserting the intellect's identifying function. But this is not the worst of the transgressions of classical theology. The worst of it is the claims that it makes about revelation. According to Weber, in order to make a claim that there is intrinsic value and validity to Christian revelation or to Christianity as a whole, first of all, you have to make an intellectual sacrifice, as Weber describes it. Christianity's claim to be the valid value rests upon the acceptance of revelation. But here's the key for Weber. The acceptance of this revelation requires a subjective condition, namely faith, that is not universally available to everyone. So for that very reason, the very, very starting point of classical Christian theology removes itself from any possible rational, intelligible conversation with anybody who does not make the same intellectual sacrifice and anybody who does not possess that fundamentally subjective state of faith. And so for that reason, Weber is going to argue that there is no possible place for theology within the academic disciplines, at least as classical theology understands it. And again, this is a very, very important point to get our arms around, because this is the same point that is often used to explain why Christianity or a religious voice has no place in politics. Politics is a rational discussion about the structure of society, but we are bringing claims that are not universally available to everybody. Therefore, a Christian has no right to bring Christian truth claims based upon revelation into the public or political sphere. So, what would theology look like then if it were an academic discipline? Well, first of all, it would have to respect the silence of reason on the intrinsic value of any given value position. It would not call upon reason to perform the identifying function, in other words. It would stay within the bounds of instrumental reason. So it would explain, for example, what rationally follows if I decide to choose Christ. What actions rationally follow from an otherwise arbitrary choice to follow Christ, or Aphrodite, Apollo, Vishnu, Allah, on and on and on. So the role of theology then is not to take any position on the validity of any given position. It's just simply to explain what rationally follows once I have arbitrarily chosen this God, that God, that God, that God, or that God. Now the problem with this, of course, is if we institute this as an academic imaginary, we have to realize that there is a theory embedded in the practice. So the question is the practice of the silence of reason, and does that end up being a poison pill for the believer who is sitting out there in the classroom and is told that they must take a neutral value position toward any given faith? We're just talking about what follows if we choose this, that, or the other. So Weber writes, if these natural sciences, again, we're calling this phrase, lead to anything in this way, they are apt to make the belief that there is such a thing as meaning of the universe die out at its very roots. And we can begin to understand the way, given the way Weber has articulated this, what might be going on both theoretically, structurally, in practice that leads to this particular result. So, with that, as I suspected, we're going to leave Guardini for later. I think I'm probably going to be up for doing this again in about 5 or 6 years. So I think I'm going to pick up here 5 or 6 years later. But I think we still understand why Guardini matters now, because these are the basic ideas that Guardini saw going on all around him. And as he took this position on philosophy of religion and a Catholic worldview, he knew all these positions. And as you read his writings, it almost sounds like he had Weber's Sciences of Vocation in front of him. The echoes in Guardini's work from these ideas are everywhere. And so we begin to understand, Guardini comes along and says, given these conditions for belief, how can a Catholic actually maintain a belief in a world like this? What type of reimagining has to happen in order to create conditions of belief that are actually amenable for faith taking root and for faith developing? So with that, we will say goodbye to Guardini, whom we never really even met, but such is the flow of time. So thanks. Yeah, I'm dead tired.
Dr. Foote said if everybody's not exhausted, he's happy to take questions for a few minutes from your questions. I'll let you field your
And we also need volunteers to answer them. So. Yes.
First of all, thank you. This is fantastic. My question has to do with this throwing out of an end and using just method to use anywhere. But then also a reverse effect of that is also throwing out method. It doesn't really matter how you get there as long as you get it cement. So there are these kind of two ideas that are surging in this meaningless, vast wasteland of the imaginary that everyone's in. Sorry. And I wonder, the people who try to bring the harmony back together, of there being a way and an end, or at least the people that are all believe in some methods get to some truth that we all believe in. This whole pluralistic idea of, well, if you're holding the trunk of an elephant and I'm holding the tail, well, at least we're all holding an elephant. They they tend to believe is the end is this amorphous amalgamation of a cloudy, happy place where everyone gets what they want. Right? Or if you throw out the end, then you invent your own end. And we know the methods to get there. If you want to have a family, well, here's the method. If you don't want to have a family, here's the method. So I want to know, how do you bring together the way, the truth, and the life where the end is not some faraway, deistic, omnipotent God who doesn't matter, and also the fact that he is method itself because he has a face, he lived a life, he's an event that happened. How do you give someone a harmony of both a way and an end without the Christological center? Because nothing else works. So like, if you throw out theology, then doesn't all of academia collapse? Because there's nothing that exists as both spheres in the same place.
Well, first of all, I think a couple of comments that come to mind. To use a Weberian term to describe Weber, Weber is an ideal type. So there are all kinds of hybrids that we meet within everyday experience of the academy and everyday experience of the world. But there are many attempts to arrive at the whole, and that's really the fundamental point of that middle age, the age that I call the age of meaning, the axial age, where there really was a tremendous amount of intellectual effort in many world cultures to arrive at that sense of the whole that will make sense of our individual life. And what we would call that is the work of natural reason. And so there are lots of examples within world history of the way in which natural reason can look at the world and actually uncover a sense that there is purpose in the world. And so I think one of the keys to sort of to rediscovering that is reading the people who did it well, like Plato. And the slogan that I use at the very beginning, I can make it all the way up to the very first slide. I think again goes to the heart of it. If I can get all the way back up there. There must be a quicker way. But it's a quote that I took from the introduction to St. Bonaventure's Breviloquium, and I picked that because Guardini was so deeply influenced by Bonaventure. But Bonaventure's method proves nothing but shows something. It shows, namely, what is already present in cognition. And I think when it comes down to it, and this is what Plato recognized, everybody actually does experience the world as meaningful. It's just a matter of uncovering that experience. And the method that Plato found to uncover that experience was the method of dialogue or dialectic. But that probably doesn't say much, but
David, what work or works by Guardini would you recommend to this audience that would most fully respond to the Weberian challenge that you have outlined for us? Where does Guardini address this best, do you think?
I think his book Freedom, Grace, and Destiny is a really interesting reflection on these issues. And as a matter of fact, many of the passages that I took from the very beginning in order to kind of paint the picture are from the early pages of Freedom, Grace, and Destiny. His book The World and the Person is also really good. I think one of the best and most available of his works that spells out his sort of theoretical positions.
One last question.
How, as an educator, do you try to combat some philosophy like this in your classroom with your students? So you come have a classroom full of students who have largely bought into this. What do you do practically to sort of get them to maybe see the world a little bit differently?
Well, in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way, I've come up with a master list of the 8 hermeneutical principles for the universe. Some of you may have But among them are I constantly talk about the transcendental values, and then I constantly talk about the faculty psychology in order to introduce a vocabulary for talking about the human person that allows you to develop these ideas. Because again, you see what you can speak. And without a vocabulary of the human person, you can't convey. A person can't begin to imagine what a human person is like. Without a vocabulary for thinking about how there is meaning in the world, you can't begin to look for meaning in the world. So I guess in many ways, one of the things I try to do is just try to begin to introduce and always use a familiar vocabulary. Because again, in many ways, a very important concept for Aquinas, for Augustine, for Guardini, is that words are like flashlights, and something can be there in front of you, but if you don't have a word for it, you're not going to see it. So it's a matter of introducing a particular type of vocabulary that opens up new ways of seeing the world. So. Well, thank you. And there are cots out there if you're ready. If you can't make it home, you can go to bed. So.
I want to thank Dr. Foote. It turns out there's lots of Guardini that's never been translated into English, especially material on the subject we've been looking at, questions of faith, culture, and nature. I'll let the cat out of the bag. Dr. Foote's there's 3 very important essays. Dr. Foote's been actually working to put together a translation of those. Encourage him. It would be great to see those in English as a title of the volume. I confess I harbor a dream with Dr. Foote at the center of it, with the Guardini project here at St. Thomas, to see his academic work, in addition to his liturgical and spiritual work, fully into English. The time is ripe. I think Catholic Studies is a wonderful place to do it. And I think Dr. Foote has made it very clear to us why that is. Guardini may be as valuable for us now as he was when he first started writing, now almost 20 years ago. Please join me in thanking Dr. Foote.